Gabriel Agreste usually wasn't one to have his morals questioned. People generally saw him as a stoic and somewhat cold man, but he had never done anything in his life that would be deemed downright evil and wrong. He stared through the glass case that he had erected in his home just a week prior. The elliptic cylinder stretched up to the ceiling and artificial lights cast rays down into the water, illuminating the various plants and shrubbery that sat on the floor. He peered through the blades of grass and seaweed and spotted the creature that hid within. The girl, if she could be called that, was huddled on the floor of the tank. Her once vibrant and iridescent scales were now a dull red, mottled with dark gray spots, and her fins floated around her languidly. Gabriel had no room to be sympathetic towards her. He had brought her home for one sole reason, and he didn't care what it took to accomplish his goal. But it was clear with the way she looked that she wasn't well, and that was going to put a dent in his plans. So with no other choice, he involved his only son, Adrien. "You called for me, father?" Gabriel heard Adrien's voice after 3 precise raps on the door. Giving him permission to enter, the door opened with a slight squeak. Gabriel frowned at the noise, mentally noting to have the housekeepers oil the hinges. The light that entered from the hallway was almost blinding after standing in the dim room for so long. Even though the light behind him made his form a silhouette, Gabriel could clearly see the look of wonderment in his son's eyes. Gabriel motioned for his son to stand beside him, and the boy complied, stepping hesitantly towards his father. Adrien and Gabriel weren't estranged per se, the latter going great lengths to make sure his son was well provided for, but they weren't particularly close. Adrien was always closer to his mother, and that's what the two had in common, great affection for the Agreste matriarch. "Is this what the construction crew is here to build?" Adrien asked as he stared in awe at the large tank before him. He had always been fond of aquariums as a child since his mother often took him there. He didn't know much about sea life, but watching the ripples of the water and the effervescence gently floating upwards as creatures swam by always calmed him. But as far as he could see, the tank was empty save for the rocks and plant life that settled at the bottom. "There aren't any fish in there," Adrien murmured idly as he walked closer to the tank. Gabriel stepped forward and joined his son's side. "There is," Gabriel started before knocking harshly against the glass. There was a sudden movement in the tank that took Adrien by surprise. One big fish. Adrien's eyes grew wide as the girl rose from the bottom, clearly startled by the noise that reverberated through the tank. Even more shocking than a girl being in the tank was a girl with a tail and fins sprouting from her back and hips. Dark midnight hair that seemed to glow an ethereal blue cascaded around her pale face, and her eyes held a deep fear within them. They had to be the most beautiful pair of eyes that Adrien had ever seen in his whole entire life. They were like the sky and the ocean all at once, such a deep yet brilliant blue that seemed to peer into his soul. She stared at him with wide eyes, as if pleading with him, pulling at every emotion in his rapidly beating heart to help her. "Father, you can't just keep her locked up in there." Adrien turned to his father and said frantically, casting away all other thoughts that swam through his brain. Gabriel raised an eyebrow, amused that his son's first response was not about the existence of mermaids, rather a remark about the ethics of keeping her captive. "Tell me, Adrien, how is this any different from keeping a pet fish?" Gabriel replied. Adrien stepped back, clearly shocked by the cold response. His father may have been distant, but Adrien never expected him to be so cruel. "Just because she has human features doesn't mean that she's human. She's just like any other creature in the sea that people capture and put up for display." Adrien felt a burning ache within his chest and pressed his lips together, a frown marring his handsome face. He couldn't believe the words that were coming out of his father's mouth. His heart had told him that his father was wrong, but his mind questioned whether he had any right to criticize the man. After all, he had grown up admiring animals at the zoo and at the aquarium, and he did not have the confidence to say that they were all in the business of helping animals instead of keeping them captive. "You will keep her company," Gabriel said. It wasn't a request, it was a demand. He needed her to be healthy, and having Adrien spend time with her was his best assurance. Adrien turned away and refused to look at the man, obviously upset. But Gabriel knew that the boy would do as told. His heart was too big and too kind, like his mother's, to let the mermaid wilt away in loneliness. Gabriel turned and walked towards the door and exited. He ignored the lingering feeling of guilt that burrowed in his gut. He reminded himself that she wasn't human, and he was going to keep telling himself that until he got what he wanted. He pinched the bridge of his nose and looked to the floor as he passed the portrait of his wife that hung on the wall. He knew she wouldn't approve, but he'd gladly take angry over what he had now. When he reached the end of the hall, Gabriel opened the door slightly and peered into the sunlit room where his beautiful wife lay peacefully still. Anyone could have mistaken her for a lifeless doll if not for the steady beeping and hum of the machines that were keeping her alive. Adrien turned his attention back to the tank to see that the mermaid had withdrawn herself to the floor of the aquarium again. Despite what his father said, he knew she was distressed. She may not be human, but she had feelings just like they did. He pressed his hands against the cold glass and leaned in slightly. He called for her softly to avoid scaring her. She sat up and turned to him again, eyes sad yet questioning. "Please don't be scared. I'm sorry about my father," Adrien apologized. It was all he could offer her. He had no idea what was going through his father's mind, and as much as he would like to have her released, there wasn't anything he could do. The room above likely provided access to the aquarium, but he was sure his father kept it under lock and key. Even if he managed to get in and free her, how would he go about getting her back to the ocean? She'd most likely suffocate out of the water before he managed to get her there. As if understanding his words, the mermaid hesitantly rose from her spot and swam over to him. His breath caught in his throat as she appeared fully before him. She was breathtakingly beautiful, and he thought that she would be even more so if he could see her smile. She pressed her hands against the glass and looked down at him with melancholic eyes. "I'm sorry," he apologized again. "I wish there was something I could do." Even though she couldn't understand his words, the way his brows furrowed and his eyes looked sorrowed let her know that he sympathized with her. He offered her a gentle smile, and it made her slightly relieved despite the situation she was in. "What's your name?" Adrien asked her, only to see her shake her head slightly and then cocking her head in confusion. "You don't understand me? I guess that makes sense," he chuckled abashedly. "I'm Adrien. I know these circumstances aren't favorable, but I want to do what I can to make sure you're comfortable. So let's be friends," he said. The mermaid just blinked and continued to watch him in confusion. "For now, I'll call you..." Adrien paused and looked at her, taking note of her coloring and pattern. He wasn't particularly knowledgeable when it came to types of fish, so when he noticed her red and black coloring, he automatically thought of ladybugs. "I'll call you Ladybug. It's strange, but that's all I can think of," he laughed sheepishly. Seeing the smile on his face, the mermaid, now called Ladybug, couldn't help but return it. His laughter abruptly stopped as he caught the act, and his cheeks flushed a deep red. "You're beautiful," he whispered. He felt mildly embarrassed after the words passed his lips, even though he knew she couldn't understand him. The two looked at each other shyly and knew that their days would be a little less lonely now that they had each other. For the next few weeks, Adrien began visiting Ladybug every day, spending almost all of his free time with her. Even though he was the only one talking, he never felt awkward. He would lie on the floor, propping his upper body up on his elbows, and watch her adoringly as she did the same. Each and every time he saw her, he noticed that her color was improving. He was in awe by how her scales would catch the light from above and how her fins flowed smoothly like flames that defied the water surrounding it. But that's what Ladybug's existence was to him. She was a magnificent girl that made everything impossible seem possible. Adrien raised a finger and began to trace letters across the glass, and Ladybug watched the digit intensely. He smiled at her eagerness. Since it didn't look like she was going anywhere anytime soon, he thought it'd be a great idea to try to teach her the language. He wasn't sure how well the lessons were progressing, but she always seemed excited about them. He would trace letters and words, saying them as he did so that she'd know how they sounded. L-A-D-Y-B-U-G. He traced the letters out endearingly, and she smiled. "I'm sure you know by now that that's what I call you," Adrien chuckled, heart fluttering as he took in her smile. He watched her lips press into a line before she raised a hand and began to trace against the glass. Her brows furrowed in concentration, and his heart thudded in his chest. It was the first time that she would try communicating with him outside of physical gestures. He watched her hand move shakily across the glass, eagerly waiting to see what she was writing. M-A-R-I-N-E-T-T-E. Adrien blinked when she finished the last E, after straining to keep his eyes open the whole time. He refused to miss any of it. He let his eyes rise to meet hers, to see her smiling shyly. "Marinette?" He spoke her written word, and she nodded. "My name," came her reply. He was so surprised to hear her voice that his body shot up into a crouch. She was startled by his sudden movement, and they both stared at each other with wide eyes. Then, a large grin broke out onto Adrien's face, and he pressed his hands against the glass happily. "You spoke!" He was beyond excited, and Marinette was quite taken aback by his enthusiasm. "You spoke!" he said again before laughing heartily. Seeing how happy he was, she pressed her hands against the glass before his and smiled brightly.